The winter solstice feast was supposed to lock the Northern Kingdom in quiet peace. Instead, it became the exact moment Evelyn Thorne's entire world shattered. The great hearth altar burned with a fierce, golden ferocity at the center of the cavernous hall. It cast long, wavering shadows against the ancient, glacier-carved stone walls that had stood unyielding against the harsh elements for 1,000 winters. For generations uncounted, this massive fire had served as the physical and spiritual heart of the northern keep. It was not merely a source of warmth meant to ward off the brutal, screaming blizzards outside. It was a sacred, elemental blaze tied inextricably to the life force of the ruling Luna. As long as Evelyn Thorne was present, breathing the crisp air of the keep, her hidden starlight lineage fed the flames. On this freezing winter solstice night, the fire leapt impossibly high. It radiated a profound, encompassing heat that smelled of dry cedar, heavily roasted venison, and melting pine resin. The entire pack was gathered to celebrate the longest night of the year. Elite warriors with heavily scarred faces laughed loudly over dented iron tankards of dark, spiced ale. Grey-haired elders whispered ancient tales near the comforting, blistering warmth of the central fire. Young, clumsy pups chased each other playfully through the grand stone aisles, their joyous yips echoing off the vaulted ceiling. It was a picture of absolute, unshakable domestic security. Evelyn sat on the high, commanding dais of carved oak. She watched her people with a soft, quiet pride. She wore a gown of heavy silver silk that pooled around her feet like liquid moonlight, shimmering with every slight, elegant movement of her body. Resting atop her dark hair was the silver hearth crown. It was a magnificent, brutal artifact forged entirely of cold silver and raw, unrefined starlight ore. It was incredibly heavy. A constant, physical pressure on her skull that served as a daily reminder of her absolute duty and her ancient bloodline. Her starlight wolf purred in the deep, protected subconscious of her mind, feeling perfectly content, anchored, and safe in the very center of her territory. Then the massive, iron-bound cedar doors of the great hall groaned open. A brutal, freezing draft rushed violently into the room. The sudden temperature drop was staggering. It bit viciously through the thickest wolf pelts and instantly stole the breath from the laughing warriors. The warm, rich scent of the feast was abruptly replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of an incoming blizzard. The hall fell utterly, deathly silent. Kenneth Winterbane stepped over the threshold. The Alpha King was a terrifying physical presence. Broad-shouldered and towering, he possessed the kind of raw, lethal grace that made seasoned, blood-soaked fighters lower their eyes in instinctual submission. His black iron crown sat stark and menacing against his dark hair. A mantle of heavy, snow-dusted bear fur draped over his broad shoulders, making him appear even larger, more feral. His storm-grey eyes swept the crowded room with an unreadable, hardened intensity. Normally, when those turbulent irises found Evelyn sitting on the high dais, they softened immediately, the icy, turbulent color shifting to a molten, fiercely protective gold. On this fateful solstice night, they remained a frozen, impenetrable grey, and he was not alone. The alien scent hit Evelyn a fraction of a second before her silver eyes processed the visual sight. It was not the crisp, dominant, challenging odor of a rival shifter. It was not the earthy, blood-stained musk of a wilderness rogue. It was entirely wrong for this world. It was cloying, weak. It smelled of sugared plums, artificial rosewater, and overwhelming, acidic human anxiety. Standing half-hidden behind the king's massive armored frame was Chloe Mercer. She was small, excessively fragile, and wrapped in a thick cloak of white fox fur that practically swallowed her trembling form. Her pale, delicate hands clutched desperately at Kenneth's dark leather sleeve. Her knuckles were white with absolute terror as she stared out at the sea of silent, predatory faces. She possessed no spiritual anchor, no magical aura, and absolutely no feral strength. She was merely a human woman, ordinary, mundane, and completely out of place in a stone stronghold built by ancient, territorial predators. Yet the sovereign, the most feared ruler in the 7 territories, was treating her as though she were made of spun glass. He curled his massive, scarred hand around her delicate shoulder in a gesture of unmistakable, agonizingly tender protection. The same physical protection he had once sworn exclusively to his Luna. Evelyn's inner beast stopped its peaceful purring instantly. It rose to its feet in the dark cage of her mind, the thick hairs on its back bristling. A low, dangerous rumble vibrated violently against her ribs. The fated mate bond, a sacred, invisible biological thread woven directly between her soul and Kenneth's, suddenly flared with a blinding, searing heat. It felt exactly as though a red-hot iron blade was being dragged slowly, deliberately across her collarbone. The physical agony of the bond, sensing a profound, foundational betrayal, was immediate, suffocating, and incredibly real. Her own blood temperature seemed to plummet, yet Evelyn did not gasp. She did not clutch her chest in pain. She simply folded her hands carefully in her lap, her own knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white as she locked every muscle in her face into place. Kenneth walked down the center aisle, physically pulling the fragile human along with him. He wrapped a massive, protective arm around Chloe's small shoulders, shielding her from the intense, glowing stares of the pack. The warriors and elders parted before them like a split sea, stepping back out of sheer confusion and ingrained instinctual respect for their leader. The silence in the cavernous hall was so absolute that the only sounds remaining were the loud, hungry crackle of the central blaze and the soft, uneven, frantic patter of the lovers' leather boots on the stone flagstones. When they reached the base of the high dais, the Alpha King stopped. He looked up at the woman he had sworn to protect in front of the goddess, the fated mate he had claimed as his absolute equal. His jaw clenched tight, a thick muscle ticking rapidly in his cheek. His fists were balled so rigidly at his sides that the heavy leather of his battle gauntlets creaked audibly in the quiet room. It was a clear, explicit sign of his self-imposed physical restraint, a desperate, subconscious wrestling with his own stubborn pride and whatever unseen manipulation was heavily clouding his judgment. "Pack," he rumbled. His voice was a low, dominant thunder that physically rattled the empty drinking cups on the long wooden tables. "I have returned from the southern borders, and I have brought an addition to the royal household." He stepped aside slightly, bringing the shrinking, terrified human into the full, harsh, golden light of the central fire. "This is Chloe Mercer," Kenneth declared. His tone brokered no argument. It projected an absolute command that demanded immediate submission from every wolf in the room. "She is my chosen companion. She will reside here, in the keep, under my direct, personal protection." A collective, stifled breath rippled rapidly through the great hall. Hundreds of amber, brown, and gold eyes darted frantically from the towering, unyielding king to the silent Luna sitting above them. They were waiting for the inevitable explosion. They expected tears, desperate begging, the pitiful, chaotic collapse of a woman who had just been publicly discarded and humiliated before her entire court. They expected her to scream, to demand her sacred rights, to shift into her wolf and brutally claw at the fragile interloper standing in her sacred home. Evelyn did nothing of the sort. She maintained a perfectly straight spine. Her silver eyes remained eerily calm, fixed unblinkingly on the man who was currently tearing her soul apart piece by bleeding piece. The burning sensation on her collarbone grew exponentially worse. It shifted into a visceral, tearing pain that made her physically nauseous, but she ruthlessly locked the agony away behind an impenetrable fortress of sheer, unbreakable dignity. Beta Marcus Vance stepped forward from the deep, flickering shadows of the stone pillars. His face was pale, his expression caught somewhere between absolute, sickening horror and his deeply ingrained military loyalty to his commander. He opened his mouth to speak, to perhaps reason with his seemingly mad king, but a sharp, cutting, lethal glare from Kenneth instantly silenced him in his tracks. Near the central fire, Shaman Ronald Sterling did not look at the king at all. The wise ancient elder was staring intently at the roaring flames. His deeply wrinkled hands shook slightly as his experienced eyes observed a subtle, terrifying change in the way the massive flames moved. The golden light was already beginning to wane, shrinking away from the coldness spreading through the room. "Evelyn," Kenneth said. He finally addressed her directly, his voice dropping from a booming royal proclamation to a harsh, gravelly, personal demand. "You will accept her presence. There is room enough in the vast halls of this stronghold for both of you. You will make her welcome." The public humiliation was a calculated, heavy weight designed to break her. It was a suffocating pressure, pressing down on her shoulders, attempting to force her to her knees in front of the entire court she had served and bled for. Evelyn Thorne stood up. The movement was slow, incredibly fluid, and utterly devoid of panic or haste. The heavy silver silk of her gown cascaded beautifully around her as she stepped down exactly one tier of the dais, placing herself physically closer to the threat. The ambient temperature in her immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees, the ancient starlight lineage in her blood answering her desperate internal call for complete emotional numbness. Not used, not owned. "Chosen," Evelyn said quietly. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a strange, resonant, magical frequency. It carried effortlessly over the crackling fire, reaching the farthest, darkest corners of the frozen hall. "I was not used for your political gain, Kenneth. I was not owned as a pretty piece of property to decorate your territory. I was chosen by the goddess to stand as an equal," she said, her tone smooth and sharp as glass. She did not spare a single glance for the shivering human hiding behind him. She kept her intense, unblinking gaze locked entirely on the storm-grey eyes of her mate. "You bring a fragile, mundane thing into a hall of ancient predators. We are small things in a world of teeth. And you have just bared yours at your own soul." He flinched violently. The physical reaction was a rapid tightening of the skin around his eyes, and a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. But she saw it clearly. He opened his mouth to argue, to issue another booming royal decree, to force her submission through sheer alpha dominance and willpower. But Evelyn did not wait for his command, nor did she give him the satisfaction of an argument. She simply offered him a slow, measured, painfully exact curtsy. It was flawless. It was the absolute epitome of courtly grace, yet utterly devoid of any warmth, respect, or love. She lifted her chin, turned her back on the Alpha King, and walked silently toward the northern corridor. She did not shed a single tear. Midnight descended upon the northern keep like a heavy, suffocating, impenetrable shroud. The winter solstice feast had ended not in joyous, drunken celebration, but in a muted, terrified, and chaotic dispersal. The pack members had slunk back to their quarters in complete silence, throwing anxious, fearful, sidelong glances toward the royal wing. The ambient, comforting warmth that usually blanketed the massive stone fortress had immediately begun to seep away. It was being rapidly replaced to us by an invasive, creeping, bone-deep chill that seemed to radiate outward from the very architecture of the walls. In her private chambers, Evelyn Thorne stood entirely alone. The grand bedroom was bathed in the pale, cold, unforgiving light of the winter moon, filtering heavily through the high, arching glass windows. The polished stone floor felt exactly like blocks of solid, unmelting ice against her bare feet, but she barely registered the severe physical discomfort. Her internal wolf was currently curled into a tight, pathetic, whimpering ball of pure agony. It was paralyzed by the traumatic, unnatural severing of their spiritual safety. The mating mark on the side of her neck throbbed incessantly. It was a deep, radiating chemical burn that felt as though her skin were slowly, agonizingly being peeled away from her muscles. She closed her eyes and breathed through the biological torment, one slow, shuddering inhalation, one measured, forced exhalation. She did not walk over to the massive, intricately carved cedar wardrobes that held her extensive collection of heavy royal gowns. She did not touch the velvet-lined lockboxes containing the brilliant diamonds, the rare sapphires, and the thick gold chains the sovereign had gifted her over their 5 years together. Those beautiful, incredibly expensive things belonged exclusively to the Lunar of the Northern Keep. They did not belong to Evelyn Thorne. Kneeling on the freezing floor, she reached beneath the heavy oak bed frame and pulled out a single wooden case. It was small, plain, entirely unremarkable, and crafted from cheap, splintering pine. It was the exact only item she had brought with her when she had first arrived at the terrifying keep years ago as an unrecognized, low-status, exhausted outsider. She snapped the rusted iron latches open with steady, unshaking fingers. Moving with deliberate, almost robotic precision, the woman folded a thick, heavily worn woolen cloak and placed it inside the empty box. She added a simple undyed linen tunic and a pair of sturdy, scuffed leather traveling boots that had seen miles of hard dirt roads. Finally, from a small hidden drawer in her nightstand, she retrieved a dried pine branch. It was a brittle, highly fragrant memory of the deep, isolated southern woods, where she had learned to survive long before she ever knew the crushing weight of a crown. She laid the fragile branch gently on top of the rough wool and closed the lid. The wooden case was incredibly light in her hand. It contained absolutely nothing of monetary or political value, yet to her it held the entirety of her true uncorrupted identity. She walked out of her grand chambers, intentionally leaving the heavy oak door wide open behind her. The spiral stone stairs of the keep were steeped in long, oppressive Gothic shadows. The castle was dead quiet, save for the howling wind outside. There were no elite guards stationed at her door. Kenneth had likely ordered them away, perhaps out of sudden, overwhelming shame, or perhaps he was entirely distracted by the scent and the demands of his new human companion in the western wing. The mere thought sent another vicious, localized spike of searing pain directly through her chest, but she ruthlessly clamped down on it, sealing the emotion behind a massive wall of ice. Never let them see you break. Evelyn reached the ground floor and moved silently, like a ghost, toward the Grand Council chamber. The room was vast, intimidating, and dominated by a massive, circular stone table where bloody treaties were forged and brutal wars were declared. The moonlight hit the highly polished granite surface, creating a stark reflection that looked remarkably like a frozen, deadly lake. She approached the edge of the table, her breathing slow and mechanically measured. Slowly, she lifted both of her hands to her head. Her slender fingers brushed the cold, unyielding metal of her heavy diadem. For 5 long years, she had worn it with absolute honor. She had absorbed the crushing political burdens of the pack, tended to their sisk pups through long, freezing nights when the healers were overwhelmed, and stood as the unwavering spiritual anchor of the entire territory. But that sacred era was entirely over. With hands that trembled only slightly, not from sorrow, but from the sheer, staggering, physical weight of the ancient artifact, she lifted the crown from her dark hair. The release of pressure was immediate, leaving a strange echoing emptiness against her skull. She lowered the brutal ring of silver and starlight ore, setting it down carefully on the highly polished granite surface of the council table. The heavy metal made a sharp, dry, final clink. It echoed loudly through the silent, cavernous room. It sounded exactly like the locking of a heavy iron cage. Evelyn did not linger to stare at the symbol of her discarded reign. She refused to mourn a kingdom that had so easily replaced her with a fragile, scentless stranger. She turned her back on the table, her silver eyes hard, focused, and entirely dry. Bending down, she picked up the single wooden case containing her simple wool cloak, her worn leather boots, and the dried pine branch that smelled of her true, forgotten home. The cheap pine handle felt rough and genuinely grounded against her palm, a stark, comforting contrast to the cold silver she had just abandoned. Without a single backward glance, the former Luna of the pack walked out through the massive cedar doors, stepping directly into the screaming, freezing teeth of the winter blizzard. The bitter wind whipped violently at her thin dress. It tore the warmth from her skin in seconds, but the cold could not touch the absolute, unbreakable fortress of her dignity. The moment her boots crossed the final threshold, leaving the ancient boundaries of the keep forever, an imperceptible shift occurred deep within the stone foundation. The ambient magic of her starlight lineage, which had silently fed the territorial fires for half a decade, abruptly severed its connection to the earth. The massive stone pyre back in the cavernous hall flickered violently, The golden, roaring flames that had smelled of warm cedar and melting pine resin suddenly shrank. Their vibrant color dulled to a sickly pale orange. A spiderweb of actual, sparkling frost began to creep slowly, silently up the edges of the high stone walls. The air turned brittle. The stone turned to ice. The northern keep was already beginning to freeze. Evelyn did not know this. She simply gripped her wooden box tighter, put her head down, and let the white storm swallow her whole. She did not look back, and she did not shed a single tear. The southern valley offered a profound, isolating silence that was fundamentally different from the aggressive, screaming blizzards of the northern peaks. Here the snow fell in thick, heavy curtains, burying the ancient pine forests in a quiet, undisturbed blanket of white. It was a place where lost things went to remain hidden. Evelyn Thorne walked through the deep drifts with a slow, mechanically measured rhythm. The cold was an absolute physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. The scuffed leather traveling boots she wore were completely soaked through, her toes numb and aching with a dull, throbbing intensity. The biting wind tore at her simple, undyed linen tunic and the thick woolen cloak she had wrapped tightly around her shivering frame. Yet she did not stop. She did not stumble. Her spine remained perfectly, rigidly straight. The physical exhaustion was immense, a heavy, dragging weight on every muscle, but it was nothing compared to the phantom sensation of the severed mating mark on her neck. It no longer burned with the immediate visceral fire of active betrayal. Instead, it had settled into a cold, deep, pulsating ache. The sacred thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding across the miles, was slowly calcifying into dead, unfeeling tissue. She carried the single wooden case by its cheap pine handle. It was her only anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted completely off its axis. By nightfall, she reached the abandoned cabin. It sat nestled at the base of a towering, jagged ridge, entirely swallowed by the gothic shadows of massive ancient cedar trees. The structure was small, built of rough-hewn logs and river stone, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of the winter snow. It was a far cry from the cavernous, glacier-carved halls of the royal stronghold. There were no towering stone pillars, no high, arching glass windows, and certainly no elite warriors guarding its threshold. It was perfect. Evelyn pushed the heavy, creaking wooden door open. The interior smelled of damp earth, old timber, and profound neglect. The temperature inside was barely warmer than the freezing wilderness, but it offered immediate shelter from the biting wind. She stepped over the threshold and carefully closed the door behind her, sealing out the storm. Moving with the same deliberate, quiet grace she had used to navigate the treacherous political courts of her former life, the woman knelt before the small, cold hearth. She did not have palace servants to fetch dry kindling. She did not have a massive territorial fire fed by generations of pack magic. She had only her own 2 hands. She unlatched the single wooden case. Her slender, labor-scarred fingers brushed past the folded clothes, reaching directly for the dried pine branch she had preserved. It was brittle, highly fragrant, and smelled fiercely of her true, forgotten origins. She placed the branch gently onto the stone grate, adding a few scraps of dry moss she had gathered along her grueling trek. Then Evelyn closed her eyes. She bypassed the whimpering, traumatized wolf curled in the dark cage of her mind, reaching deeper into her own bloodline. The ancient starlight lineage was not tied to a crown, nor was it dependent on an Alpha King's validation. It was an earthbound, instinctual magic. A soft silvery glow began to emanate from her palms. It was not the roaring, golden ferocity of the Northern Keep's territorial flame. It was a quiet, steady, ethereal light. When she pressed her glowing hand to the dry moss, a spark caught immediately. The fire bloomed. It crackled softly, a warm, silvery blue flame that instantly banished the damp chill of the room. The heavy, comforting aroma of burning pine and crushed mint filled the small cabin, layering perfectly over the scent of old timber. The temperature in the room rose steadily, creating a dense, sensory pocket of absolute safety. The magic in her veins pulsed in quiet rhythm with the leaping flames, answering the primal call of a space that finally belonged entirely to her. Evelyn sat back on her heels, letting the profound heat wash over her frozen face. She stared into the small, obedient flames. For 5 years, she had silently anchored an entire kingdom, pouring her life force into a massive altar to keep a cursed realm from freezing, only to be cast aside for a fragile, scentless stranger. She had held up their sky, and they had simply assumed it was the weather, never again. 3 days passed in a blur of quiet, rhythmic domestic survival. Evelyn settled into a simple, grueling, but deeply satisfying routine. She chopped her own wood, the rhythmic thud of the iron axe against the freezing timber, serving as a physical release for her lingering tension. She gathered resilient winter roots and dried herbs from the snowy ridges, grinding them into pungent, healing pastes using a heavy stone mortar and pestle. On the evening of the 3rd day, a heavy knock shattered the quiet sanctuary of the cabin. Evelyn did not flinch. Her inner wolf lifted its head, its ears swiveling toward the sound, but it did not sense the aggressive, dominant aura of a royal tracker. It sensed physical pain. She opened the door to find an old, weather-beaten merchant leaning heavily against the doorframe. His lips were blue, his hands wrapped in ragged, frost-covered wool. He was a rogue shifter, disconnected from any pack, caught entirely off guard by the unnatural, sudden ferocity of the early winter storms blowing down from the north. "Please," the old man rasped, his voice trembling violently. "The cold, it is unnatural this year. It bites right through the fur. I will freeze if I do not find a hearth." Evelyn did not demand a toll. She did not ask for his allegiance. She simply stepped aside and ushered him into the absolute, enveloping warmth of her starlight hearth. She sat him in a sturdy wooden chair and immediately went to work. Her movements were highly efficient, stripped of all royal ceremony. She boiled snow in an iron kettle, brewing a thick, dark tea of crushed mint and willow bark. When she pressed the steaming clay mug into his shaking, frost-bitten hands, the old shifter let out a long, shuddering sigh of absolute relief. He looked at the quiet woman tending to him. He saw her plain woven shirt. He saw the dark bags of exhaustion under her striking silver eyes. He did not know that the woman wrapping a warm, herbal poultice around his freezing fingers had, just 3 days prior, worn the most powerful crown in the 7 territories. He did not know that entire armies had bowed to her. All he knew was the staggering, miraculous warmth radiating from her scarred hands. "You have a healer's touch, lady," the merchant whispered, his teeth finally stopping their frantic chattering. "The pack's up north. They would pay a fortune in gold for hands like yours. The Alpha King's territory is notoriously brutal. They say the royal healers are always overwhelmed." Evelyn paused. Her thumb rested lightly against the rim of the heavy clay mug. A singular, sharp pang of sorrow echoed in her chest for the pups she had left behind, but she quickly sealed it beneath a massive layer of impenetrable ice. "I am not interested in gold," Evelyn said quietly. Her voice was smooth, carrying that strange, resonant frequency that made the old man blink in sudden awe. "And I do not serve kings. I choose who I heal." She turned her back to him, moving toward the small window to gaze out at the darkening, snowy valley. The reflection in the cold glass showed a woman stripped of all royal artifice. She was beautiful the way a blade was beautiful, sharp, tested, and entirely unadorned. She was no longer a decorative piece of property waiting for validation. She had vanished like smoke through a crack in the world, and in doing so she had finally found herself. While the southern valley settled into a warm, quiet domestic rhythm, the sovereign's fortress was rapidly descending into a biological and architectural nightmare. 3 days had passed since the massive cedar doors had closed behind the departing Luna. 3 days since the ancient, glacier-carved stone fortress had begun to subtly, irreversibly change. Kenneth Winterbane stood in the center of the Grand Council chamber. His towering, broad-shouldered frame was rigid, his fists clenched so tightly behind his back that the thick leather of his battle gauntlets whined under the immense strain. His piercing gaze was locked in a fierce, unblinking glare on the highly polished granite surface of the circular table. Resting exactly in the center of the stone was the silver hearth crown. It remained exactly where she had left it. The brutal ring of cold silver and raw starlight ore looked stark, heavy, and completely dead without her dark hair to frame it. The Alpha King's jaw ticked rapidly. His inner beast was pacing frantically in a tight, aggressive circle within his mind. It was snarling, snapping its jaws at empty air, driven half-mad by the sudden, terrifying silence on the other end of their fated bond. The biological connection had not broken completely. A true mate bond could not be severed by mere distance, but it felt horrifyingly hollow. A deep, radiating cold had settled directly over Kenneth's collarbone, a phantom frostbite that no amount of thick fur could warm. Yet his human pride remained a towering, insurmountable fortress. "She is testing me," Kenneth rumbled. His voice was a low, dominant growl that vibrated violently against the stone walls. He was not speaking to the empty room. Beta Marcus Vance stood near the arched doorway, his posture stiff, his face pale and drawn. The loyal second-in-command had barely slept since the solstice feast. He looked at the discarded crown, then at the king's rigid back. "My king," Marcus began carefully, his tone laced with deep, undeniable apprehension. "Our scouts report no sign of her on the main roads. The blizzards have buried all tracks. She took nothing but a single wooden case, if she is caught in the high passes." "She is throwing a childish tantrum," Kenneth interrupted, his voice snapping like a frozen whip. He turned away from the table, pacing toward the high glass windows. "She expects me to crawl into the snow and beg her to return. She expects me to cast aside my chosen companion to soothe her wounded ego. I will not." He stared out at the screaming white expanse of his territory. The winter is brutal. The cold will bite through her stubbornness. Her wolf's devotion to the bond will override her pride. She will return to the keep when she realizes she cannot survive the high country frost alone. It was a colossal, arrogant miscalculation. He relied entirely on the absolute biological pull of the fated mate bond, blind to the fact that he had been the one to brutally drag a red-hot iron blade across it. Marcus did not argue. He simply bowed his head, though his hands trembled slightly at his sides. The ambient temperature inside the massive stone fortress had plummeted significantly in a mere 72 hours. Kenneth's breath plumed in a thick, white cloud every time he exhaled, even inside his own private council chamber. The fires in the sacred basin were failing. Frost was already beginning to creep up the edges of the high stone walls. Yet Kenneth stubbornly refused to see it as anything more than a harsh winter draft. He stubbornly believed his own authority could command the elements just as it commanded his pack. But the elements did not obey a blind king. By the third week, the northern keep had transformed into a complete, inescapable tomb of ice. The extreme cold deepened across the entire territory with unnatural, aggressive speed. It was not a normal seasonal shift. It was a targeted, suffocating freeze that drained the life force from the earth itself. The pack's pups were whimpering softly in the lower levels, unable to stop their small bodies from shivering violently, despite being surrounded by double layers of heavy bear fur. The elders were falling ill, their lungs rattling with fluid and frost. The ambient magic of the keep was failing completely. Kenneth strode into the great hall, his heavy boots echoing sharply on the frozen flagstones. The scene that greeted the sovereign was one of quiet, creeping devastation. At the center of the room, the great hearth altar was dying. The massive, territorial fire that had burned with a fierce, golden ferocity for generations was shrinking rapidly. Servants frantically shoveled dry cedar and heavy oak logs into the stone grate, but the wood refused to catch properly. The flames were a sickly, pale orange, choking on thick, grey ash. They emitted no heat, only a thin, acrid smoke that stung the eyes. Huddled entirely too close to the dying embers was Chloe Mercer. The fragile human was swathed in layers of heavy white fox fur, shivering uncontrollably. Her pale, delicate hands hovered over the weak flames, seeking a warmth that simply did not exist. The cloying, artificial scent of sugared plums and rosewater rolling off her skin was frozen and brittle in the frigid air. It mixed sickeningly with the smell of dying ash. Kenneth's inner wolf recoiled violently as the scent hit his nostrils. Instinctually, the ancient predator within him recognized the devastating truth. This fragile creature possessed no spiritual anchor. She was completely useless to the pack's survival. She provided no ambient magic, no territorial protection, and absolutely no warmth. The beast wanted to bare its teeth and drive the interloper out into the snow, desperate to clear the space for the true missing Luna. However, Kenneth forced the primal instinct down. He clamped an iron restraint over his own biology, walking forward to place a massive, scarred hand on Chloe's trembling shoulder. It was a stubborn, desperate attempt to validate his own disastrous choice. "It is freezing, Kenneth," Chloe whispered weakly, her voice thin and grating against the oppressive silence of the hall. Why will the fire not burn? Before the king could offer a comforting lie, a deafening sound shattered the quiet. It sounded exactly like a cannon firing inside a closed vault. It was sharp, violent, and carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a dying mountain. Everyone in the great hall flinched. Elite warriors dropped their hands to their iron blades, their amber eyes scanning the shadows frantically for an attack. But the threat was not an enemy pack. It was the architecture itself. Near the edge of the high dais, Shaman Ronald Sterling was standing perfectly still, his deeply wrinkled face drained of all color. He was pointing a trembling hand at the dying embers. A thick, jagged fissure had violently split the solid granite right down the middle. Spidery patterns of ice were physically crawling out from the fresh crack, spreading rapidly across the stone floor like a living, predatory disease. The frost was thick, unnatural, and completely unresponsive to the pathetic, dying flames of the hearth. Kenneth froze. His massive hand tightened painfully on his lover's shoulder, completely oblivious to her sudden whimper of discomfort. His grey irises widened in absolute, paralyzing shock. "The wards," Shaman Ronald whispered. The elder's voice carried over the panicked murmurs of the pack, heavy with the weight of ancient, forgotten history. "The territorial wards are rotting." Marcus stepped forward, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Shaman? What is happening?" "The stone. It does not freeze like this." Ronald slowly turned to look directly at the Alpha King. There was no fear in the old man's eyes, only a profound, devastating pity. "This is not weather, Beta Marcus," Ronald said solemnly, his voice shaking with the sheer gravity of the revelation. "This is the Winterbane, the ancient curse placed upon the royal bloodline of the North. It was written in the old texts that the sovereign's soul would eventually freeze the very earth he stood upon, turning his kingdom into a monument of dead ice." Kenneth's jaw clenched so hard a muscle threatened to snap. "The Winterbane is a myth, a story meant to frighten unruly pups in the dark." "It is no myth, my king," Ronald countered, pointing a trembling hand at the dying flames. "For 5 years you have ruled in absolute warmth. For 5 years the ice has been kept at bay, not by your iron crown, not by your military strength." The shaman took a slow, deliberate step toward the shivering human wrapped in fox fur before turning his gaze back to the towering sovereign. "It was kept at bay by her," Ronald stated, the words falling like heavy anvils in the dead, silent room. "The woman you cast aside. The starlight lineage was the only earthly magic, pure enough to anchor the territorial fires against your cursed blood. She absorbed the frost so you could rule in the light. This human, she carries no spiritual anchor. She is empty. Without Evelyn Thorne's magic, your curse is unleashed." A profound, suffocating silence slammed into the hall. The Alpha King stared at the cracked stone pillar. The reality of his colossal mistake began to violently dismantle the impenetrable fortress of his pride. He had assumed Evelyn was simply a beautiful, quiet woman who happened to be his fated mate. He had deemed her replaceable, easily cast aside for a fragile human diversion. He had not known she was the only thing keeping his entire kingdom from suffocating under a mountain of ice. A name unspoken for 3 weeks suddenly grew teeth, sinking viciously into the king's chest. Evelyn. Kenneth's inner wolf threw its head back in the dark confines of his mind and let out a raw, agonizing, blood-curdling howl of pure despair. The physical pain in his collarbone flared with the heat of 1,000 dying suns. He had not just driven away his mate. He had driven a dagger directly into the heart of his own realm. By the 4th week, The Alpha King could no longer endure the silent, suffocating death of his own territory. Leaving the failing fires and the useless, shivering human behind in the cavernous keep, Kenneth launched a frantic search across the frozen ridges. He did not take a battalion of elite warriors. He went alone, entirely consumed by the physical agony of the decaying, neglected mate bond. The blizzards were aggressive, screaming torrents of white ice that lashed against his thick fur. He shifted into his massive black wolf, driven entirely by biological desperation. The cold was absolute, biting right through his coat, freezing the moisture on his snout, but he refused to stop. The phantom frostbite over his collarbone had spread, creeping into his chest, freezing the very chambers of his heart. Every step he took without her felt like dragging an iron chain across broken glass. He spent days tearing through the high passes. He dug through snowbanks. He snarled at the howling wind. His striking eyes were wild, bloodshot, and completely devoid of royal composure. The king was dead. There was only the beast, starving for the scent of warm cedar and melting pine resin. For days he found nothing but dead ice. Then, finally, near the edge of the southern valley, he caught it, a faint, incredibly distant scent of pine and crushed mint. It was barely a ghost of a trace, buried beneath layers of heavy snow, but to Kenneth's freezing, desperate senses, it was a beacon of pure, burning gold. He lunged forward, his massive paws tearing up the snowdrifts as he followed the scent trail down into the shadow of the ancient cedar trees. It was the 5th week of the winter freeze when Kenneth Winterbane finally found her. He was severely weakened. The Winterbane curse, unchecked by her presence, was turning his own blood to slush. The unnatural cold had seeped into his bones, draining his immense supernatural stamina. By the time the small, rough-hewn log cabin came into view, the Alpha King was barely dragging himself forward. He shifted back to his human form, his broad-shouldered frame swaying violently in the biting wind. He was not wearing his iron crown. He was not wearing his battle gauntlets. He was just a dying man, stumbling toward the only source of warmth left in the world. He collapsed heavily onto his knees right at the threshold of the cabin. His large hands, numb and blue with frostbite, struck the heavy wooden door. It was a weak, pathetic sound, completely stripped of all dominant authority. The door opened. Evelyn Thorne stood in the doorway, framed by the bright silvery blue light of her starlight hearth. She was wearing her modest cloth garment, her hands dusted with dried herbs. The heavy, comforting aroma of burning pine rolled out from the cabin, washing over Kenneth's freezing skin like a physical embrace. His inner wolf let out a pathetic, shuddering whimper of relief. Mate, he tried to rumble, but the word came out as a broken, shivering rasp. His storm-grey eyes, once so commanding and cruel, looked up at her with profound, begging desperation. He expected her to shatter. He expected her to drop to her knees and drag him into the warmth, crying tears of joy that her sovereign had finally come for her. Evelyn did not move. She looked down at the massive, shivering man bleeding onto her porch. Her striking silver eyes were completely devoid of the unconditional devotion they had once held. There were no tears. There was no pity. The massive layer of impenetrable ice she had built over her heart held firm. "You are freezing the wood, Kenneth," she said quietly, her voice smooth and carrying a businesslike detachment that felt worse than a physical blow. She did not address him as her king. She did not address him as her mate. She treated him entirely as a freezing, burdensome stranger who had shown up uninvited at her door. "Please," Kenneth rasped, his pride completely shattered on the icy floorboards. "Evelyn, the cold. If you die on my threshold, it will draw scavengers," Evelyn stated, her spine perfectly, rigidly straight. Without another word, she stepped aside, offering a narrow space for him to enter. She did not reach out to help him up. She did not offer him the soft touch of her labor-scarred hands. She simply waited, cold and unyielding, as the most powerful wolf in the 7 territories dragged his broken body across the floorboards. As soon as he was inside, she closed the heavy cedar door, sealing out the blizzard. She did not offer him a warm blanket. She did not kneel to tend to his wounds. Establishing the strictest of boundaries, she stepped back into the shadows of the hearth, leaving him to nurse his own wounds. The shadows of the silvery blue starlight fire stretched long and distorted across the rough-hewn floorboards of the cabin, casting flickering shapes that danced against the timber walls. Evelyn stood perfectly still in the warm enclosed space, a silent and unyielding guardian of her own sanctuary. She watched the once terrifying sovereign of the northern keep reduced to a shivering, broken mass at her feet. The ambient temperature inside the small room was thick, profoundly comforting, and smelled heavily of crushed mint, dried lavender, and burning pine resin. It was the scent of survival, yet the man bleeding onto her threshold carried the distinct, suffocating aura of an open grave, pulling a vacuum of icy death into her safe haven. The dark frost creeping up his pale skin was a visceral testament to his own absolute arrogance. It was actively necrotizing his flesh. Kenneth pulled himself forward by a fraction of an inch, his blackened, frost-bitten fingers dragging against the cheap wood, leaving thin smears of frozen blood. His heavy battle gauntlets were gone, lost somewhere in the hundreds of miles of screaming blizzards and treacherous ice he had violently forced himself through. His broad-shouldered frame, usually a towering monument of lethal, predatory grace that commanded absolute obedience from thousands, shook with violent, uncontrollable tremors. His familiar gaze was entirely bloodshot, the irises blown wide with a frantic, instinctual panic that had completely overwritten his human pride. He opened his mouth to speak, to perhaps issue a royal command or a desperate plea, but all that escaped his cracked blue lips was a wet, rattling wheeze that sounded like tearing parchment. Evelyn did not rush to his side. She did not drop to her knees. She did not cradle his massive, heavy head against her chest the way she once would have. Desperate to ease his burdens, she simply looked at him, her face a smooth mask of starlight and stone. Her spine remained a rigid, unbending line of absolute dignity. The mating marks scarred deep into the delicate skin at the side of her neck began to throb with a vicious, localized heat. It was a biological siren screaming at her, burning with the instinctual demand to bridge the physical gap and heal her dying mate. It hurt beautifully, terribly, but she ruthlessly locked the primal instinct away behind a massive, impenetrable fortress of psychological ice. She had spent 5 years being the invisible, unappreciated shield for his kingdom, quietly absorbing the brutal cost of his lineage while he looked right through her. She was no longer a piece of royal property obligated to fix his catastrophic mistakes. A sudden, sharp spasm seized the Alpha King's chest. He coughed violently, his massive frame convulsing as a splatter of dark, freezing slush hit the clean floorboards. The profound, agonizing physical deterioration happening right in front of her was not merely the result of a harsh winter storm. The sacred thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding across the miles, carried the horrific truth directly into her own nervous system. It was an invasive, parasitic rot. It was the ancient decree of the Winterbane coming to collect its due. 400 miles to the north, the grim reality of that rot had already plunged the royal stronghold into a terminal nightmare. The ancient stronghold was no longer a sanctuary of ancient stone and unyielding territorial strength. It had become a sprawling, inescapable tomb. The lethal frost had entirely breached the inner sanctums, completely ignoring the thickest velvet tapestries and the heaviest iron-reinforced doors. It was a targeted, magical absolute zero that drained the ambient life force directly from the air, turning every exhalation into a cloud of crystalline dust. The most devastating toll was taken on the most vulnerable. Deep in the lower levels, where the hearth fires usually roared the brightest, the packs young and old were actively dying. Thick, double layers of heavy bear and wolf fur were entirely useless against a cold that originated from the sovereign's own cursed bloodline. Pups whimpered weakly in the dark, their small, fragile bodies shivering so violently that they could not sleep, their lips turning a sickening, bruised blue. The elders, veterans of countless brutal territorial wars who had survived fangs and claws, found their lungs filling with fluid and sharp, microscopic shards of ice. The proud, Fierce wolves of the north were being quietly, mercilessly suffocated in their own beds. They were fragile prey in a realm of predators, and the apex hunter here was the freezing cold itself. In the center of the cavernous great hall, the massive stone altar was entirely dead. The great hearth altar stood as a grim, terrifying monument to the broken bond. There was no golden ferocity to push back the shadows. There was no comforting smell of roasted venison or melting pine resin. There was only a massive, pathetic pile of cold, grey ash and cracked granite. The spidery patterns of ice that had started near the base of the dais, the moment Evelyn set the silver hearth crown aside, had now consumed the entire room, crawling up the ancient pillars and turning the vaulted ceiling into a jagged, heavy canopy of deadly icicles. Huddled in the absolute center of this devastation, shivering uncontrollably on the high dais, was Chloe. The fragile human lover was wrapped in 5 layers of elite winter pelts, sobbing hysterically into her pale, delicate hands. The cloying, artificial scent of sugared plums and rosewater that had once captivated the blinded king had turned completely sour, reeking of raw, pathetic terror and impending death. She possessed absolutely no spiritual anchor. She offered no ambient magic to push back the encroaching cold. Her human presence was entirely empty, a decorative, useless fragility that was currently costing an entire civilization its life. The keep demanded a primal sacrifice, and she had nothing but tears to offer. The bitter, gnawing frustration within the royal household had finally boiled over into outright, dangerous mutiny. Marcus stood near the shattered remains of the High Council table, his breath plumbing in thick white clouds. The loyal second-in-command had deep, dark bags under his eyes, his skin pale and taut over his cheekbones. His hand rested heavily on the hilt of his cold iron blade, his knuckles white with tension. He was struggling desperately to keep order among the elite warriors. But the feral, instinctual panic of the pack was overriding their military discipline. They were predators trapped in a freezing cage, and their amber eyes were turning increasingly, murderously hostile toward the shivering human weeping by the dead ashes. They smelled the weakness. They smelled the end. "We cannot survive another night of this," Marcus had gritted out, his voice sharp and ragged, echoing off the frost-coated stones as he addressed the empty throne. "The pups are fading. The women are freezing. We traded the sun for a candle, and the wind blew it out." The realization of the sheer magnitude of the betrayal had fractured the pack's fierce loyalty. They did not blame the weather. They blamed the king. Deep beneath the frozen great hall, down in the darkest, forgotten crypts of the stronghold where the founders were buried, Shaman Ronald had finally uncovered the exact, terrifying mechanics of their doom. The wise, ancient elder sat at a cracked stone desk, his gnarled hands trembling violently as he carefully turned the brittle, dust-covered pages of the ancient records. The massive tome was bound in pale, hardened leather, its heavy iron clasps rusted with centuries of neglect. The ink upon the thick parchment was dark and reddish-brown, written in the crushed bone and dried blood of the first Alphas. Marcus had descended into the freezing crypts, following the scent of old paper and despair, to find the old man weeping silently over the open pages. "It is not just the stone," Marcus, Ronald had whispered, his voice echoing hollowly against the frost-covered walls, completely stripped of its usual spiritual reverence. The shaman pointed a shaking finger at the dense, archaic runes. "The Winterbane curse was never a myth. It is a biological parasite, tied directly to the sovereign's soul." The beta had stepped closer, his jaw tight, his own wolf whining at the heavy scent of inescapable doom. "What do the ancient records say, old man? How do we burn it out?" "We do not," Ronald stated, closing his eyes in profound, devastating despair. "The text is absolute. The Alpha's bloodline is fundamentally corrupted by the ice. The only countermeasure ever forged by the goddess was the pact with the starlight lineage. A true lunar of that blood does not merely sit on a dais and wear the silver hearth crown. She acts as a living, breathing, magical filter. She absorbs the necrotic cold of the king's soul and converts it into the territorial fire." Marcus stared at the heavy book, the horrific realization finally sinking in. heavy as a stone in his gut. And without her, the Winterbane curse consumes the beast first, Ronald explained, his voice dropping to a terrified rasp. The Alpha's inner wolf begins to actively decay. It rots from the inside out. Kenneth's physical strength will fail. His mind will shatter. He will become a feral, freezing monster before his heart finally stops. And when the king dies to the frost, the territory dies with him. There is no recovery. There is no cure. There is only her. This absolute, uncompromising truth was the sole reason the Sovereign had finally broken. It was not a sudden, romantic epiphany that had sent Kenneth Winterbane tearing out into the screaming blizzards, leaving his fragile new lover behind. It was the desperate, undeniable biological reality of a dying realm and a rotting soul. The ancient records had officially confirmed that Chloe Mercer was worse than useless. She was a death sentence. The physical decay of his own wolf had forced him to plan a desperate recovery hunt, completely stripping away the last, stubborn remnants of his towering royal pride. He had to cross the frozen ridges. He had to drag himself to the feet of the woman he had humiliated, or his entire lineage would be permanently erased from the earth. The violent, burning throbbing of the mating mark snapped Evelyn abruptly, back to the present moment in the warm, cedar-scented cabin. The geographical distance meant absolutely nothing to the biological tether. She could feel the exact, agonizing echo of the necrotic rot tearing through the massive man currently kneeling on her floorboards. Kenneth lifted his heavy, storm-grey eyes to meet her cool, unblinking silver gaze. His broad chest he heaved with the effort of simply breathing. The thick muscle in his jaw ticked erratically, a final, pathetic sign of his self-imposed physical restraint, as he fought the overwhelming feral urge to lunge forward and press his freezing, dying skin against her radiant warmth. He clamped his fists tightly against the floor, voluntarily keeping his dangerous, corrupted body away from her. He was terrified of hurting her, terrified of his own monstrous condition. The keep, Kenneth rasped, his voice a hideous, grating sound of tearing metal. The pups, they are dying, Evelyn. He did not offer a grand, poetic apology. He did not attempt to justify the catastrophic humiliation of the winter solstice feast, where he had demanded she accept Chloe into the royal household. He simply laid the horrific, unvarnished truth of his failure at her feet, offering it up as a bloody sacrifice. The central fire is dead, Evelyn. Cold stone and grey ash. It will not burn for her. It only burns for you. The silence in the small, cedar-scented cabin was absolute, save for the wet, tearing sound of the Alpha King's laboured breathing. Evelyn Thorne did not move. She simply stared down at the massive, shivering man who had once been the centre of her entire universe, her hands calmly folded before her. The violent throbbing of the mating mark, scarred deeply into the delicate skin of her neck, did not merely transmit his current, pathetic physical state. The fated mate bond was a highly sensitive biological conduit, an ancient thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding. In that moment of his absolute vulnerability, it violently forced her to endure the exact sensory nightmare of his journey. She felt it all. The memory of his hunt crashed into her mind with the crushing force of a frozen avalanche. Through the jagged, bleeding connection of the neglected mate bond, Evelyn felt his inner beast screaming in pure, unadulterated agony. The Alpha King had not tracked her with the strategic, calculated prowess of a royal predator. He had been completely blinded by the screaming blizzard, his massive paws torn and bleeding as he threw his weight against snowdrifts that stood as high as castle walls. The Winterbane curse had acted like a physical, biological parasite. She could feel the echo of it in her own veins, a terrifying, invasive chill that dropped the temperature of his blood until it turned to a sluggish, agonizing slush. Every single muscle in his broad-shouldered frame had seized during the trek, screaming for a relief that did not exist in the white wasteland. The cold had bitten right through his thick, black fur. It had formed a heavy, suffocating armor of ice over his back, weighing him down until his belly dragged against the jagged rocks hidden beneath the snow. The skin of his paws had literally torn away on the sharp ice, his blood freezing the instant it hit the ground, forming cruel, jagged ice claws that dug deeper into his own flesh with every desperate step. It had calcified his joints. It had frozen the moisture in his lungs, turning every desperate inhalation into a lungful of shattered glass. He had dragged his dying body through the high passes driven by sheer, feral desperation. The physical pain of the severed soul thread had ripped his nervous system apart, creating a phantom frostbite that consumed him from the inside out. He was a sovereign rotting in real time, his supernatural healing completely disabled by the ancient curse he had foolishly unleashed upon his own bloodline. Evelyn could feel the exact moment his towering royal pride had finally snapped. It had happened somewhere on the third ridge, when his human mind realized that, without her, he was nothing but a freezing corpse wearing an iron crown. During those agonizing 5 weeks of deep winter, Kenneth had learned the devastating truth, the cloying, artificial scent of Chloe Mercer, a human who possessed no spiritual anchor, no lineage and no magic, had offered absolutely zero warmth. Her presence at the Northern Keep was a useless, decorative illusion against the brutal reality of nature. Chloe was a fragile diversion. She could not hold back the ancient dark. The only thing that had kept his heart beating in the absolute zero of the northern ridges was a scent. It was the faint, impossibly distant aroma of pine and crushed mint. In the horrific, vivid memory flashing across her own nerve endings, Evelyn felt how Kenneth's beast had latched onto that specific scent profile as if it were a physical rope, suspended over a bottomless abyss. The starlight magic, embedded deeply in her scent, had been the only biological beacon, cutting through the screaming torrents of white ice and the sterile, metallic smell of the winter storm. His wolf had howled into the wind, a pathetic, shattered sound of a creature desperately trying to outrun its own dying biology. The phantom smell of melting pine resin had dragged him, inch by brutal inch, across the lethal expanse of the southern valley. His clouded vision had been completely blind to the treacherous terrain, focused solely on the invisible trail of warmth she had left behind in her wake. He had crawled through the snow, stripped of his iron crown, stripped of his heavy battle gauntlets, and stripped of his arrogance. He had been reduced entirely to an instinctual hunger for his true anchor. The sheer magnitude of his physical suffering was staggering. It would have killed any elite warrior in his pack days ago. But the Alpha King had forced his heart to keep pumping, powered by the terrifying realization of his own catastrophic mistake. He had realized, too late, that the woman he had, publicly humiliated at the winter solstice feast, was the only thing keeping his entire kingdom from suffocating under a mountain of ice. Now that grueling, impossible journey was over, but the damage was catastrophic. Kenneth was barely inside the cabin. His massive frame was practically draped over the rough-hewn threshold, his heavy leather boots still half exposed to the biting draft, seeping under the heavy cedar door. He had dragged himself out of the physical storm, but his soul was still entirely trapped in the ice. The dark, necrotic frost creeping up his pale neck was not melting in the ambient heat of the room. It was actively fighting the silvery blue starlight fire radiating from Evelyn's hearth, creating a violent, localized temperature clash that caused the air immediately around him to shimmer and distort. His dark hair was matted with frozen blood and heavy clumps of snow that refused to thaw. He lifted his heavy, storm-grey eyes. They were completely devoid of any royal command. There was no alpha dominance left in him, no towering arrogance to shield his colossal vulnerability. They were the bloodshot, frantic eyes of a starving, freezing animal that had finally reached the hearth, only to realize he had forgotten how to ask for the fire. Warmth, Kenneth begged. The word was a wet, rattling gasp, barely audible over the crackling of the logs. It was a sound that completely shattered the terrifying myth of the kingdom's invincible sovereign. To speak the single syllable required immense physical effort, his throat lined with microscopic shards of frost that tore at his vocal cords with every exhalation. He did not reach for her. He kept his blackened, frost-bitten fingers clamped rigidly to the floorboards, his knuckles white with the immense, agonizing effort of self-restraint. He was voluntarily anchoring his dangerous, corrupted body to the cheap pine wood, terrified that if he touched her, the necrotic rot of his curse would seep into her pure skin. His broad chest heaved irregularly, the frozen leather of his armor cracking audibly with every shallow breath. A low, pathetic whimper vibrated deep within his throat as his inner wolf rolled onto its back in the dark cage of his mind, submitting entirely and unconditionally to the woman standing above them. "Please, Evelyn," he rasped, his cracked blue lips trembling violently. "Just a fraction of the hearth. I am suffocating in the frost." Evelyn looked down at him. Her own starlight wolf was pacing frantically in her subconscious, clawing desperately at its mental restraints. The instinctual, biological demand to bridge the physical gap, to drop to her knees and wrap her radiant warmth around her freezing mate, was overwhelming. The mating mark on her collarbone burned with a vicious, searing heat, screaming at her to heal him, to absorb his pain as she had done silently for so long. She remembered the countless nights she had quietly siphoned the cold from his bones, after long, grueling council meetings, a vital, invisible labor he had entirely taken for granted. She remembered the physical weight of the royal circlet upon her brow, heavy with the responsibility of an entire territory's survival. She did not yield. Evelyn locked the primal instinct away behind a massive, impenetrable fortress of psychological ice. She stood perfectly still, her spine a rigid, unbending line of absolute dignity. The heavy, comforting aroma of burning pine rolled around her, highlighting the stark contrast between her radiant, self-made safety and his decaying aura. When she had walked out of the northern keep 5 weeks ago, carrying nothing but her single wooden case, she had resigned herself to a life of quiet isolation. She had built this sanctuary with her own bleeding hands, surviving the brutal snows by drawing on her own deep reserves of magic. She had healed a freezing rogue merchant when he stumbled onto her property. She had chopped her own wood. She had proven to herself that she did not need a king to survive. She was no longer a decorative piece of property waiting for validation. She had spent her entire tenure as his Luna, being the unappreciated shield for his kingdom, and she would not simply melt because he had finally realized he was freezing. "You demanded I accept a fragile, scentless stranger into the heart of the northern keep," Evelyn said quietly. Kenneth physically recoiled at the mention of Chloe Mercer. The extreme cold of the past 5 weeks had brutally stripped away all illusions. Her presence in the keep had only accelerated the decay. Shaman Ronald had warned him that a human could not survive the spiritual void left by a true Luna, let alone anchor a cursed bloodline. But his pride had deafened him to the warnings. Her voice was smooth, carrying that strange, resonant frequency that vibrated effortlessly in the small room. She did not yell, she did not sneer. Her tone was completely, devastatingly calm, delivering each word with surgical precision. "I was blind," Kenneth choked out, his vocal cords tearing further. "I thought the great hearth altar burned because of my bloodline, but it turned to ash the exact moment you laid the silver hearth crown on the council table. I watched the flames die, Evelyn. I thought it was a temporary fluctuation. I thought my alpha blood was enough to command the elements. I was a fool. You thought the keep protected you because it was built by your ancestors," she countered, her silver eyes hard and unblinking. "You believed the ancient territorial fires burned on your authority alone. You assumed the warmth was a birthright, handed to you simply because you wore an iron crown. But stone is just stone, Kenneth. It holds no loyalty. Stone does not bleed for you. Stone does not love." Kenneth flinched violently, as if she had struck him with a physical blade. He squeezed his bloodshot eyes shut, a tear of semi-frozen slush escaping his lashes to hit the floorboards with a soft, pathetic tap. "We are small things in a world of teeth," Kenneth, Evelyn continued, delivering the stoic warning without a single ounce of pity. "The winter does not care about your royal titles. The ancient pacts do not care about your pride. You brought a mundane human into a stronghold built by predators, completely blind to the starlight magic that actually kept the ice at bay. You traded a sacred, biological anchor for a fragile diversion, and you expected the elements to bow to your delusion. She took one slow, measured step forward. The heavy silver silk of her past was long gone, replaced by the simple, undyed linen tunic of a survivor. She stopped exactly 3 feet away from his trembling form, refusing to bridge the final gap. "Marcus is trying to hold the borders," Kenneth whispered, his voice cracking on the beta's name. "But the pack is turning on itself. The frost. It drives them mad." Shaman Ronalds searched the ancient records of the first alphas. He found the truth. The Alpha King's massive frame shuddered as another violent wave of necrotic cold assaulted his nervous system. The Winterbane curse. "It isn't just cold, Evelyn. It is a biological parasite. Without a starlight Luna, it will turn me into a feral monster. It will destroy the territory. And now, my pups are dying. My elders are suffocating in their own beds, and my beast is rotting from the inside out." The Alpha King let out a broken sob. It was a raw, hideous sound that tore through the quiet cabin, completely devoid of any regal composure. The most feared ruler in the 7 territories was weeping on her floor, utterly destroyed by the consequences of his own blindness. His broad shoulders shook, the black leather of his coat cracking under the strain of the frost. He did not attempt to make excuses. He did not try to leverage his royal authority. He simply offered his failure as a bloody, freezing sacrifice at her feet. "You came to my threshold begging for warmth," Evelyn stated, her gaze locking onto his devastated, pleading eyes. "But you do not get to claim the Luna's fire after discarding the woman. A name spoken in arrogance grows teeth, my king, and a bond discarded in the frost breeds ice." She looked at his blackened hands, clamped so desperately to the wood to keep himself from rushing her. She saw the profound physical restraint he was exercising, the desperate attempt to protect her from his own curse, even as he was dying from it. It was a stark contrast to the man who had paraded his human lover through the great hall. This was not the arrogant sovereign. This was the penitent beast, brought completely to heel by the unforgiving laws of nature. "I will not heal you because I am your fated mate," Evelyn declared, her tone establishing a strict, unbreakable transactional boundary. "I am no longer your property to be summoned, nor am I a convenient tool to warm your kingdom when your human diversion fails. If I help you, and if I return to the keep, it is solely because I refuse to let innocent pups pay the price for their sovereign's colossal arrogance. Do you understand me?" Kenneth Winterbane did not argue. He did not attempt to negotiate or demand his fated rights. He simply bowed his heavy, dark head until his forehead rested against the rough-hewn floorboards, right at the very tips of her scuffed leather boots. "I understand," he whispered, his breath pluming weakly in the air between them, the words shivering with profound regret. "Whatever you demand, Evelyn. My life, my crown, just save my people." Evelyn stared at the top of his head. For a long, silent moment, the only sound in the cabin was the crackle of the silvery blue flames and the frantic, uneven thud of his failing heart. The physical distance between them felt as vast as the frozen ridges he had just crossed. It was a chasm built of betrayal, and she would not leap across it just because he was finally willing to look down. Then, very slowly, she reached out. She did not touch his skin. She would not offer him the ultimate, profound intimacy of skin-to-skin contact, not yet. Trust had to be rebuilt through physical action, through months of domestic routine and undeniable proof of his devotion. Her dignity demanded strict boundaries. Instead, Evelyn knelt with deliberate, mechanical grace. She extended her hand, the celestial heritage glowing softly beneath her scarred flesh, and pressed her warm palm against the cheap pine floorboards, exactly 1 inch away from his blackened, frost-bitten fingers. The ambient magic flared. The ancient Starlight Lineage Pact, a sacred biological mechanism designed to filter the Alpha's necrotic cold, activated the moment her skin made contact with the wood. The energy was profound, an elemental force that smelled of ozone and hot embers. A wave of intense, localized heat radiated outward from her hand. The silvery blue light bled directly into the rough-hewn pine, tracing the natural grain of the floorboards, like glowing rivers of molten silver. The heat travelled seamlessly across the short distance, pushing back the creeping aura of death that clung to him. As the warmth enveloped his freezing limbs, the heavy, comforting aroma of burning pine spiked in the small room, masking the metallic tang of his frozen blood. It was not a cure, it was a calculated lifeline. Kenneth gasped, a ragged, desperate intake of air, as his entire body shuddered violently. His dark veins, previously rigid with the Winterbane's ice, began to slowly pulse with liquid blood again. The peripheral warmth seeped into his necrotizing flesh, stopping the rapid progression of the curse without granting him the full sensory relief of her actual touch. The excruciating agony of the thaw hit him, but he welcomed the pain, burying his face against his arms as he wept silently into the wood. His inner wolf let out a long, exhausted sigh, finally able to rest in the safety of her proximity, even if it was just on the very edge of her warmth. She watched the way his broad shoulders slumped in pure, unadulterated relief. He did not push the boundary. He did not attempt to crawl closer and grab her hand. The terrifying ruler who had commanded armies and dismissed her worth in front of hundreds was now completely domesticated by the simple, terrifying reality of survival. He was kept exactly at the boundary. He would have to earn every single inch of closeness from this moment forward through acts of service, profound humility, and unyielding patience. The days of him taking her invisible labor for granted were permanently burned to ash. "We leave at dawn," Evelyn said, rising back to her feet, her spine perfectly straight. "You will sleep by the hearth, but you will not cross the center of the room." She turned her back on the Alpha King, leaving him kneeling in the periphery of her light. She had vanished like smoke through a crack in the world, and the woman he had found in the shadows was no longer a decorative queen. She was a sovereign of her own making, beautiful the way a blade was beautiful, and she held the absolute, terrifying power to either thaw his kingdom or let it freeze forever. The silvery blue light of the starlight hearth slowly gave way to the pale, sterile grey of dawn filtering through the frosted window panes. Inside the cedar-scented cabin, the atmosphere was dense with unspoken tension. Evelyn Thorne stood by the small wooden table, her movements precise, unhurried, and completely devoid of the nervous flutter that once defined her interactions with the Alpha King. She folded her rough-spun shirt and placed it into her single wooden case. The cheap pine box had been her only companion when she walked away from the epicenter of northern power. Now it would accompany her back into the heart of the nightmare. Every fold of fabric she packed was a testament to her quiet survival, an assertion that she required nothing from the vast riches of the kingdom to sustain her own existence. Across the room, Kenneth Winterbane remained exactly where she had left him. The terrifying sovereign of the northern keep had spent the entire night huddled on the rough-hewn floorboards, strictly observing the physical boundary she had drawn. He had not crossed the center of the room. His massive, broad-shouldered frame was hunched, his knees pulled toward his chest in a posture of complete, domesticated submission. The peripheral warmth of her magic had seeped into his necrotizing flesh, halting the aggressive rot of the Winterbane curse, but it had not cured him. His dark hair was still matted, his storm-grey eyes sunken into hollow, bruised sockets from weeks of agonizing deprivation. The phantom frostbite still lingered over his collarbone, a biological chain binding his soul to the consequences of his own arrogance. Evelyn snapped the rusted iron latches of the case shut. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly in the quiet space. Kenneth flinched slightly, his inner beast lifting its head in the dark cage of his mind, whining softly at the sharp sound. He watched her every movement with the desperate, unbroken focus of a starving animal tracking a distant light. The fated mate bond, the sacred thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding across the miles, now pulsed with a tentative agonizing hope on his end. But on her end, it remained sealed behind a massive, impenetrable fortress of psychological ice. "The storm has broken," Evelyn said, not looking at him. Her voice was smooth, maintaining that strange resonant frequency that vibrated against the timber walls. "The high passes will be treacherous but passable. "We leave now." She did not offer him a warm cloak. She did not prepare him a hot broth to soothe his torn vocal cords. She walked toward the heavy cedar door, her scuffed leather boots making soft, rhythmic sounds on the floorboards. She was no one's tool, no one's possession, but an equal by divine right. He had treated her as property, a convenient tool to warm his kingdom, while his eyes wandered to fragile distractions. He had assumed her devotion was a biological guarantee. Now, he was experiencing the terrifying reality of a woman who had chosen to walk away and could easily do it again. Kenneth struggled to his feet. His calcified joints popped audibly, the frozen leather of his ruined armor grinding against itself. He swayed violently, his massive hands reaching blindly for the wall to steady his failing equilibrium. He clamped his jaw shut, refusing to let out a sound of pain, terrified that any display of weakness might cause her to change her mind and leave him to rot. He was exercising absolute micro-tactile self-restraint. When she walked past him to open the door, he deliberately shrank back, pressing his broad shoulders against the timber, ensuring that not a single inch of his cursed, freezing skin accidentally brushed against her pure, starlight aura. Evelyn noticed the gesture. Her silver gaze tracked the deliberate space he maintained. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the domineering alpha who had once paraded a fragile, scentless human through the great hall, physically crowding Evelyn's space to force her submission. He was learning, but it was only the beginning of a lifelong penance. The heavy door swung open, revealing a world buried in blinding white. The ambient temperature plummeted instantly as the freezing wind rushed into the cabin, desperate to swallow the warmth. But Evelyn stepped out onto the porch, and the cold did not touch her. She closed her eyes and called upon the primordial magic in her blood. A soft silvery blue glow erupted from her skin, forming a visible, radiant halo around her simple woolen cloak. It smelled heavily of ozone, hot embers, and crushed mint. The snow beneath her boots instantly melted, turning into warm, rising steam. Kenneth stared in absolute, paralyzing shock. For 5 years he had believed her magic was merely a passive filter, a quiet, invisible labor that occurred naturally in the background of his reign. He had never seen her weaponize it. He had never seen the sheer, elemental magnitude of the power she had kept leashed to make him feel like the undisputed sovereign. "Walk strictly within my shadow," Evelyn commanded, stepping off the porch and carving a path of bare, steaming earth through the massive snowdrifts. "If you fall behind, the frost will take you. I will not stop to carry you, Kenneth. My only objective is reaching the innocent before their lungs fill with ice." The journey back across the northern ridges was a grueling, silent march through a graveyard of ice. The landscape was unrecognizable. Ancient pine trees were encased in thick, spidery patterns of ice, their branches snapped and dangling like broken bones under the immense weight of the freeze. The sky above was a flat, unforgiving slate grey, offering no sun, no hope, only the promise of more snow. Evelyn led the way, her spine perfectly, rigidly straight. The single wooden case swung gently from her hand. She did not falter. She did not slip on the treacherous, hidden ice floes. Her starlight magic acted as an absolute shield, a moving sanctuary of warmth that pushed back the deadly, targeted cold of the ancestral freeze hanging over the territory. Behind her, Kenneth walked in absolute silence, placing his heavy boots exactly into the steaming footprints she left behind. He was a terrifying predator reduced to a desperate follower. Every time the wind shifted, carrying the heavy, comforting aroma of melting pine resin from her skin directly into his nostrils, his inner wolf let out a soft, pathetic whimper of relief. The biological pull of the fated bond was agonizing. He wanted nothing more than to close the distance, to wrap his freezing arms around her waist and bury his face in her dark hair, begging for the total sensory relief of her touch. Hours bled into a numbing eternity of white powder and jagged stone. The phantom frostbite in Kenneth's chest threatened to paralyze his lungs, his breathing turning into shallow, rattling wheezes. Yet he forced his massive frame forward, powered entirely by the sight of her unwavering posture. She was a beacon of pure burning gold in a world of dead white. As they reached the final overlook, the sprawling valley of Valdron opened up below them. The Alpha King stopped, his breath catching painfully in his throat. The northern keep, the ancient glacier-carved stone fortress that had stood as the invincible heart of his empire for generations, was a complete ruin. It looked exactly like a massive, jagged iceberg jutting out of the earth. Thick, unnatural glaciers had formed over the high arching windows. The grand watchtowers were completely encased in a suffocating layer of blue-white frost, the heavy iron banners snapped off and buried. There were no patrols. There was no smoke rising from the chimneys. It was a monument of absolute, suffocating death. Evelyn stopped at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the frozen tomb. Her silver eyes were hard, calculating, and entirely dry. "My kingdom," Kenneth whispered, the words tearing like rusted metal from his throat. He fell to one knee in the snow, overwhelmed by the sheer catastrophic scale of his failure. "I destroyed it. I traded the sun for a fleeting, hollow diversion, and the wind blew it out." Evelyn slowly turned her head to look at him. She did not offer a comforting platitude. She did not reach down to pull him up. "You forgot my name, Kenneth," she said quietly, the words carrying easily over the howling wind. "You saw the crown on my head, and you felt the warmth in the hall, but you forgot the woman generating it. You believed a fragile human could replace an ancient pact, simply because you commanded it so. But a name unspoken for 5 years grows teeth, and those teeth have bitten your realm to the bone." He bowed his head, accepting the verbal blade without flinching. "I will never forget again, if you burn this frost away, if you save them. I will kneel before you in front of every surviving wolf. I will strip myself of my title. I will be your guard, your servant, whatever you demand." "I demand nothing but my autonomy," Evelyn stated, her tone shifting into a sharp, unyielding absolute. "I am not returning to take back the position of Luna. I am returning to unbind the innocent from your catastrophic mistake. When the fire is restored, I will hold the ultimate authority of the hearth. You will not command me. You will not claim me. You will earn the right to stand in my presence, day by day, until I decide otherwise." "I accept," Kenneth rasped instantly, his hollow gaze lifting to meet hers with frantic, desperate sincerity. "I accept, Evelyn, completely." She held his stare for a long, agonizing moment, searching for any trace of the towering arrogance that had once blinded him. She found nothing but a shattered man, terrified of the dark, willingly handing over the keys to his soul. She turned back toward the frozen keep. "Then let us wake the dead." They descended into the valley, the heavy iron gates of the outer courtyard standing wide open, frozen permanently on their rusted hinges. The snow here was littered with the bodies of frozen ravens and shattered stone gargoyles that had cracked under the extreme temperature drop. The silence was absolute, a heavy, oppressive blanket that felt heavier than the snow itself. As Evelyn crossed the threshold of the stronghold, the ambient, necrotic magic of the parasitic frost immediately sensed her presence. The air itself seemed to hiss, a violent, localized temperature clash erupting as her silvery blue starlight aura collided with the lethal cold. The ice crawling across the flagstones violently retreated from her scuffed leather boots, melting into harmless puddles of water before immediately turning into hot steam. She walked straight to the massive, heavy cedar doors of the great hall and pushed them open. The cavernous room was a nightmare of gothic shadows and lethal cold. The high, vaulted ceiling was a jagged canopy of massive, deadly icicles poised to drop like guillotines. The elite warriors of the pack were huddled in the corners, wrapped in dozens of thick pelts, their amber eyes glazed over with the sluggish, creeping apathy of late-stage hypothermia. Near the center, a group of frantic mothers were curled tightly over their whimpering pups, desperately trying to shield the fragile bodies with their own freezing flesh. Standing near the shattered remains of the High Council table was Marcus Vance. His face was a ghastly, pale mask, his lips entirely blue, frost clinging to his eyelashes. His hand was practically frozen to the hilt of his iron blade, loyalty keeping him upright, even as his biological systems failed. Nearby, Shaman Ronald knelt in the ash, his ancient records of the first alphas clutched tightly to his freezing chest, shivering violently as he muttered prayers to a moon that had abandoned them. When the massive doors opened, Marcus slowly lifted his head. His dull, dying eyes widened in absolute, staggering disbelief. Evelyn Thorne stepped into the hall. She was not wearing the heavy silver silk of a queen. She wore a simple, undyed linen tunic and a coarse woolen cloak, but to the freezing, desperate pack, she looked like a descending goddess. The soft, radiant halo of starlight magic surrounding her pushed back the oppressive shadows, filling the dead air with the heavy, miraculous scent of burning pine and crushed mint. Behind her, dragging his ruined body like a penitent ghost, came the Alpha King. A collective, shuddering gasp rippled through the dying wolves. The sheer shock of seeing their terrifying sovereign reduced to a limping, broken follower was entirely eclipsed by the staggering, overwhelming wave of warmth radiating from the woman he followed. Evelyn did not pause to greet them. Her striking silver eyes locked onto the absolute center of the room. The great hearth altar was a massive pile of cold grey ash and cracked granite. Resting exactly in the center, perfectly encased in a thick, unyielding block of solid ice, was the silver hearth crown. Huddled at the base of the dais, wrapped in a mountain of white fox fur, was Chloe Mercer. The human lover was a pathetic, shivering mass. Her pale, delicate hands were completely blue, her tear-stained face sallow and drawn. The cloying, artificial scent of sugared plums and rosewater had completely soured, reeking of raw terror and impending death. She had offered nothing to the pack. She had possessed no spiritual anchor, no ancient bloodline, no capacity to absorb the heavy, biological cost of ruling a cursed realm. She was completely, entirely irrelevant to the survival of the species, a fragile ornament that had shattered under the weight of real magic. When the fragile woman saw Kenneth, she let out a weak, rattling sob and tried to crawl toward him. "Kenneth, you came back. The cold. It's killing me." Kenneth did not even look at her. His stormy gaze was locked entirely on Evelyn's back, his broad-shouldered frame rigid with absolute micro-tactile self-restraint as he stayed precisely within the boundaries she had set. The brutal reality of nature had completely stripped away his delusion. The mortal weeping on the floor was the catalyst of his realm's destruction, a mistake he had elevated out of sheer hubris, and he felt nothing for her now, but a profound, sickening disgust directed entirely at himself. Evelyn ignored the interloper entirely. She walked straight past the shivering woman, her scuffed leather boots leaving steaming footprints on the frost-covered stone. She did not waste a single word of anger or jealousy. The human was a small thing in a world of teeth, and Evelyn was the architect of the fire. She reached the edge of the ruined monument. The physical devastation of the stone was profound. The ice had driven deep fissures into the granite, trying to permanently shatter the territorial anchor. Evelyn set her single wooden case down on the floor. She reached out, her slender, labor-scarred fingers hovering just inches above the block of solid ice that held her former crown. She did not reach for the silver. The metal was merely a symbol. The true power was in her blood. Evelyn closed her eyes and took a slow, deep, shuddering inhalation. She bypassed the tight, defensive cage of her own trauma, reaching down into the absolute depths of the ancient starlight lineage pact. For 5 years, she had quietly filtered the king's necrotic cold, acting as an invisible shield. Now, the shield was gone, and she was the sword. She slammed both of her glowing palms directly onto the frozen ash of the altar. The impact sounded like a thunderclap inside a closed vault. A massive, blinding shockwave of pure silvery blue energy erupted from her hands. It was not a gentle, gradual thaw. It was a violent, elemental detonation of warmth. The solid block of ice encasing the silver band instantly exploded into a cloud of superheated vapor. The dead, grey ashes within the massive stone grate ignited with a deafening roar. A colossal pillar of golden roaring fire shot directly up toward the vaulted ceiling. The heat was staggering. It washed over the cavernous hall like a physical tidal wave, carrying the heavy, deeply comforting aroma of dry cedar, heavily roasted venison, and melting pine resin. The spidery patterns of ice clinging to the high stone walls instantly hissed and dissolved, cascading down as warm rain. The jagged icicles hanging overhead melted in seconds, washing the ancient stone clean. The biological effect on the pack was immediate and miraculous. The shivering pups let out sharp, joyous yips as colour rushed back into their pale, bruised faces. The elders took deep, shuddering breaths, the microscopic shards of ice in their lungs melting into harmless vapour. Elite warriors collapsed onto their knees, tearing off the heavy layers of thick fur as the glorious, blistering warmth penetrated their freezing bones. Shaman Ronald wept openly, dropping his head to the wet stone in absolute reverence. Evelyn stood at the epicenter of the inferno, completely untouched by the flames. The golden light reflected brilliantly in her striking silver eyes. She was a sovereign of her own making, breathing life back into a dead world with the sheer unmatched force of her hidden lineage. Behind her, the sudden, massive influx of territorial magic slammed directly into Kenneth Winterbane. The ancient pact re-established its connection. The necrotic rot of his ancient affliction, which had been slowly turning his blood to slush, was violently purged from his nervous system. The phantom frostbite over his collarbone vanished in a burst of searing heat. His inner wolf let out a massive, rumbling roar of absolute triumph and relief, shedding the agonizing decay that had plagued it for 5 weeks. His physical strength returned in a rushing, intoxicating flood, but he did not use it to assert dominance. Instead, Kenneth Winterbane stepped forward into the full, harsh, golden light of the central fire. He bypassed the shivering, weeping form on the floor without a single glance. He walked directly to the base of the high dais, where Evelyn stood above him, bathed in the roaring flames. The Alpha King, the most terrifying and powerful ruler in the 7 territories, went down on both knees. The heavy thud of his body hitting the warm stone echoed clearly over the crackling fire. He bowed his dark head deeply, exposing the vulnerable, scarred back of his neck to her completely. He pressed his massive, calloused hands flat against the flagstones, submitting his absolute physical and political authority to the woman he had once tried to discard. "My Luna," Kenneth rumbled. His voice was no longer a broken, rattling wheeze. It was a deep, resonant thunder, heavy with profound, unshakable devotion and deep, agonizing regret. "My anchor, my sovereign." A collective gasp rippled through the great hall. Marcus Vance immediately dropped to one knee, driving his iron blade into the stoss in a salute of ultimate respect. Within seconds, every single warrior, elder, and mother in the room followed suit. The entire northern keep knelt before the woman in the simple linen tunic. The human was left sitting entirely alone in the center of the bowing wolves, her white fox fur slipping from her shoulders as she stared in wide-eyed, horrified realization at the absolute irrelevance of her existence here. She was a ghost in a hall of true gods, and she had just been permanently erased from the narrative. Evelyn looked down at the massive man kneeling at her feet. She did not feel a sudden, magical rush of complete forgiveness. The trauma of the winter solstice feast, the agonizing burn of the severed bond, and the weeks of cold isolation in the southern valley were not instantly erased by a grand gesture. Trust was a house built brick by brick, and Kenneth had only just laid the foundation. But as she looked at his bowed head, at the absolute micro-tactile restraint he was showing by not reaching out to touch her without permission, the massive layer of impenetrable ice she had built over her heart finally registered a single microscopic crack. She reached out and picked up the forged silver from the hot stone. It was no longer a cold, heavy burden. It felt warm, resonant, and entirely alive in her hands. She did not place it on her head. She held it loosely at her side, a symbol of a power she no longer needed to wear to prove her worth. "The hearth fire will never die again," Evelyn said quietly, her voice projecting effortlessly across the kneeling pack, establishing the new, absolute law of the territory. "Because it no longer belongs to the crown, or to the king. It belongs to me, and I will share its warmth only with those who remember its true cost." Kenneth lifted his molten, fiercely protective gaze to look at her. His eyes burned with a lifetime of promised penance. He did not ask for a timeline. He did not demand an immediate return to their marital bed. He simply nodded, accepting the long, grueling path to redemption that lay before him. The thawing of Valdren would be remembered for generations. The historians would write of the winter that nearly swallowed the kingdom, and the Alpha King, who was forced to crawl through the snow to find his soul. But the true story remained in the quiet, burning embers of the great hearth altar. It was the story of a woman who refused to weep when she was discarded, who vanished like smoke through a crack in the world and returned to rebuild it from the ashes.